And today's program will consist of a video of Nicholas Carr, the author of The Shallows. He will present the main concerns of his book, after which I will review a number of important points not covered in the video that will draw mostly from his book and a few others which will provide greater insight. So Nicholas Carr is an acclaimed writer whose work focuses on the intersection of technology, economics, and culture. This book was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It came out in 2010 and was a New York Times bestseller. Second edition came out in 2020. He's a visiting professor of sociology at Williams College in Massachusetts and was the former executive director of the Harvard Business Review. So we have a video of him talking about his book first, which we can show now, Don.
Okay, give me a moment here. I got to do my technical stuff. It's all fun. So,
that's why I never keep a hammer near the computer.
There is that issue we need to be concerned with. Just ignore these pictures. I got to get to the right page.
For those of you
here.
Okay, Fred, are you ready to? I'm ready to start this now if you are. So,
yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so life is worth living and the glass is half full. But Bertolt Brecht said, "The man who is laughing has not yet heard the bad news." Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Nicholas Carr.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses. Thank all of you very much. Let me start by asking how many of you have a smartphone either on your person or near your person right now? It's pretty much unanimous. Well, my goal is by the end of my talk, when you go out for your lunch break, I want you all to go out, following the example of Network, all go out onto the sidewalk and smash your smartphones. But that might be setting the bar too high, so at least think about smashing your smartphones. We humans crave information. We crave it the way we crave sex, way down deep in our synapses, deep in our neurons. There have been studies that show that whenever we find a new piece of information, or even when we go out and seek a new piece of information, a little bit of dopamine is released in our brain. And as you probably know, dopamine is a pleasure-producing chemical, neurotransmitter, very, very important to brain function, but also implicated in pretty much all kinds of addictions. What dopamine basically does is encourages you to do something over and over again by making it pleasing. So we have what seems to be a very deep instinct to seek out and gather as much information as quickly as possible. And when you think about it, I think it becomes clear pretty quickly why this evolved in our brains, why this instinct. I mean, when you think about what it must have been like in hunter-gatherer times, or earlier than that even, being able to find new information, to know everything that was going on around you, probably increased substantially the odds of your survival. You wanted to see that tiger before it jumped on you, or you wanted to see that little berry bush so you could have dinner for the evening and stay alive. So we have, deep in our biology, this desire to know everything that's going on around us. And that's amplified by another very basic instinct, our social instinct. We get rewards when we know what other people are thinking about us, what conversation is going on around us. Even just having more information than other people makes us socially attractive. Raises our social status. So we have these very deep instincts to go out and gather as much information as possible. And for most of human history, that was fine. In fact, the reason they call them survival instincts is they add to our odds of survival. But think about what we've done in recent years. We've created, essentially, this new environment in which we live more and more, a digital environment that we enter through our smartphones, that we enter through our computers, our tablets, that's all wrapped up with social media and the internet. We've created an environment of unlimited information. And then we've geared that environment to push information to us all the time through our phones and other devices, from Google or from Facebook or from Twitter or whatever. So we have this instinct, this very primitive instinct, to want to know everything that's going on around us. And then we've created an environment in which there's no end to new information that's out there. And what we begin to see very, very quickly is this, compulsive kind of behavior. And my guess is, since most of you walk around with cell phones or smartphones all the time, you've probably seen that kind of compulsive behavior in yourselves. Pulling out your phone, even when nothing's going on and there's not even any particular reason to do it, you'll pull it out just to see, who knows, maybe there's something going on. And certainly if there's any indication that you've got a new message or a new notification, well, you'll pull out your phone. And for a lot of people, the last thing they do before they go to bed, check your phone or your computer. First thing they do when they get up, check your phone or computer. And if you have a bad night's sleep and wake up at 2 in the morning, well, you might as well check it then too, because something interesting could have happened. And when you look at the science of our behavior, you see all sorts of evidence that, in fact, this is taking place. There have been studies of how long people spend on looking at individual web pages when they're browsing the web or Googling stuff, looking for information. It's about 10 seconds. And that includes the time it takes for the page to load. And what's very interesting in that research is it doesn't matter how much information or even how good the information is on the web page. The researchers in one study, they added a lot of text or added a lot of images. The time people stayed on the individual page stayed at about 10 seconds. So clearly what you want to do is grab the gist of what's on the page, then find a link and click and go somewhere else so you can get some new information. There was an interesting study of what happens when people have computers in front of them at work. This was a few years ago. Researchers went out. They wanted to find out how often people glance at their email inbox. First, they asked the people, how often do you glance at your email inbox? And people said, 2 or 3 times an hour. Then they put these eye-tracking goggles on them that actually tracked where their focus was, and they found that people glanced at their email inbox 20 to 30 times an hour, 10 times more than they were even conscious of. So every couple of minutes. If you look at studies of teenagers in their phones and texting, you find that the average teenager sends or receives about 3,300 texts a month these days. For teenage girls, it's actually over 4,000 texts a month. And that breaks down to one text about every 6 minutes throughout your entire waking life. And if you think adults show any more restraint around their gadgets, well, forget it, because the latest studies of how often an adult will pull out his or her smartphone and look at it during the course of the day, it's about 160 times, which works out to about once every 6 minutes during your waking life. And as we know from that email study, that's almost surely an understatement, because people consult their phones, consult the internet, consult social media all the time without even consciously realizing they're doing it. Well, this kind of behavior is very good for internet companies. If you're Google or Twitter or Facebook, you want people to constantly be checking their phone, constantly go online. You don't want people to stay put at any place for very long. And the reason for that is that these companies, and almost all internet companies, make more money the more quickly we jump from bit of information to bit of information. That's when they gather more information about us, and that's also when they gain new opportunities to show us the advertisements that ultimately fund their businesses. So this is very good for internet companies, but what about for ourselves and the way we think and the way we use our minds? You might say, well, we're just adapting to a new technology. We've had new technologies, new information technologies, new media technologies for hundreds of years now. Every time one comes along, we adapt our way of thinking to suit the technology. And so we're becoming, maybe it's good to be scatterbrained. Maybe it's good to be distracted all the time and interrupted all the time. And we're optimizing our mind to live in this new environment. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think we are very good at adapting. We have flexible, malleable minds. But we need to look at the downsides. Because even if we adapt, that doesn't mean that we end up better people or better thinkers after that.
40% of 25 is the same as 25% of 40. After all these years, I finally understand
Process of adaptation. And if we look at what the internet and all this technology is actually doing to the way we think, the picture gets much, much darker. And it all has to do with how our brains transform information, mere information, into knowledge, giving us the ability to think deeply, to think rich thoughts, to think conceptually and critically. And the way this happens really has a lot to do with two forms of memory. On the one hand, you have what's called your working memory, and that's basically the contents of your conscious mind at any given moment. It's what you're thinking about. And what we know about working memory is it has a very, very tiny capacity. You can only fit about 2 to 4 elements of information in your conscious mind at any given moment. And then the other form of memory is what we refer to when we refer to memory, which is our long-term memory. And this has an enormous capacity. In fact, nobody's ever filled up their long-term memory. Nobody's ever said, that's it, can't remember anything anymore, it's full. So it's incredibly expansive, incredibly large. And the key to deep thinking is being able to take the information that's coming into your mind, from what you're learning, the conversations you're having, what you're reading, this very, very small capacity of working memory, and transfer it to your long-term memory. And that's a process called memory consolidation. And it's only during memory consolidation that you connect that new piece of information to everything else you've learned and thought and experienced in your life. And it turns out knowledge isn't about these fragments of information that we can pick up all the time today. It's about the connections and associations that we make inside our own brains among all the pieces of information we gather. It's only when you make those connections that you get rich thinking, rich knowledge. Maybe, if you're lucky, you even end up with some wisdom. The problem is that there is a break. It's very easy to break this consolidation process. Because you have such a small capacity in your conscious mind, if you're overloaded with information, nothing stays there very, very long. Because in order to take in that new tweet or notification or Facebook update or Google result, you have to clear out something that's already in your conscious mind. And what we know about the consolidation process is it only happens when we're attentive, only happens when we concentrate for some period of time on new information. It's attention that triggers the transfer of information to our long-term memory and allows us to create all of these connections. And what we've created for ourselves with this rich, vibrant digital environment is a constant source of disruption, interruption, distraction. That means we're never keeping information long enough in our attention to form these rich connections. And this is more than just a theoretical concern. We see growing bodies of scientific evidence that show this happening. There was a very important study done a few years ago at Stanford in California where the researchers gathered 2 groups of people. One, people who spent a lot of time online, a lot of time multitasking, glancing from one message to another. They called these the heavy multitaskers. And another group of people that did much less of that, which they called the light multitaskers, they gave these two groups of people 6 standard basic tests of cognitive function. How deeply they thought, how well they thought. The heavy multitaskers did worse on all 6 of the tests. One of the tests was a test of multitasking skill itself. Heavy multitaskers did worse on the multitasking test. Although if you ask them, they say, oh, I'm great at multitasking. I do it all the time. What really happens is that they're burning up all their mental energy, switching from one thing to another. And if they just focused for a little while on one thing, they would perform much, much better. But to me, the most interesting, most revealing of these tests was one that examined how well people are able to distinguish important information from trivia. And here, the heavy multitaskers performed much worse than the light multitaskers. And what the scientists theorize, and I think this makes complete sense, is that the more time we spend jumping from bit of information to bit of information every couple of minutes during our day, the less we worry about how important something is, and the more we're simply attracted to whatever's new. So it's the new thing that grabs our attention. For instance, if it's a nice little cat video, you'll go to the cat video. You won't focus, even if you have something very important, very interesting in front of you. And so that's what we've created for ourselves, is this world in which, thanks to our technology, we're constantly subverting our ability to think our deepest, most profound thoughts. And there was another study done a couple of years ago in which a woman named Patricia Greenfield at the University of California at Los Angeles went out and examined 50 different experiments that had been done over the years to see how different technologies, different media influence the way we think. What she concluded was that there is a benefit for all this time we spend online. We seem to have greater visual acuity. And what's meant by that is we can shift our focus more quickly among more images, more things on a screen than we were able to do before. But the trade-off here, what we lose in optimizing our brain for shifting our attention, is what she described as mindful knowledge acquisition, creative thinking, reflective thinking, critical thinking. Now, however much we might appreciate that we've optimized our brains to shift our focus very quickly, I think most of us would agree that those things, mindful knowledge acquisition, the ability to think critically and to think conceptually and deeply, those are really the fundamental aspects of the highest forms of human thinking. And essentially, by becoming slaves to our technology, we've cut ourselves off more and more from those highest forms of thinking. I'd even argue that as a society, we're starting to pretend that that doesn't matter. We place all our focus on the speed with which we can gather new information.
Son, we're grabbing burgers for dinner if you're interested.
I'm vegan.
And that's always been a very important part of being intelligent, to gather new information. But it's only the first stage of using your mind in the fullest way possible. The second and more important stage is actually to cut yourself off, to screen yourself from all that incoming information and consider deeply, think deeply about what you've discovered. And it's that second process, more important process, that is fading more and more away from us. And as I argue, as a society, we're kind of saying, oh, that doesn't matter. What matters is the speed of the consumption of information. So if there's the one overarching danger that I think we face as individuals and as a society in our dependency on on our smartphones and our computers and the web, it's that we're sacrificing our ability to determine for ourselves what our minds focus on, what we pay attention to. We're ceding that incredibly important function to the technology itself. And we know that Facebook and all these other companies are happy to take over that function for you, happy to determine what you look at. But it seems to me, if we sacrifice that fundamental quality of our mind, the ability to determine for ourselves what we're going to think about and how much time we're going to spend thinking about it, then for all the gains the internet has given us, we'll be sacrificing perhaps the most important thing that governs the depth of our thought. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So I bet now you're not so sure. Nicholas, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
Can't hear you.
Why don't you start speaking? See if we can hear you.
I have to unmute Fred, that was very interesting, but now you're up with your part.
Yes.
And I'm sorry about the
I'm
commercials,
going-
but I cut them off as quick as I could.
I'm going to share my screen. And okay. I first encountered this book as an audiobook last summer, and it had such an impact on me that I bought a hard copy and I digested the content a second time. And that spurred me to read several other books, as you can see listed here, on related aspects of neuroscience. And I recall back in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan, if anybody remembers that name, he published a book called Understanding Media, The Extension of Man. And a key phrase from that book, which was floating around a lot, was the medium is the message. Basically, McLuhan understood back then that every new media form changes us. And to add a little levity here. Oh, sorry. As you can see, people change their priorities over time. But I began to question what is happening in our brains when new media induces changes in us. And the answer, it seems, lies with neuroplasticity. That is the ability of our brain to change with input and our surroundings. This slide shows in the top, if you can see that, a dartboard where, excuse me, the performance is not very good, but with practice, the darts are centered more around the bullseye. And in the middle diagram, it shows a picture of description of the cortex of our brain and how much area is devoted to the task, but with practice, a larger area in the cortex is now recruited to complete the task. And at the synaptic level, where neurons communicate with each other, basically there are more neurotransmitters produced, which makes the communication between the neurons for this task much more efficient. So brains are moldable, they're changeable, and these changes are based on changes in anatomy and changes in chemistry. The brain has the ability to reprogram itself basically on the fly, altering the way it functions. And although different regions of the brain are associated with different aspects of our mental functioning, individual neurons do not play rigid roles. They're flexible, and they could change with experience, circumstance, and need. Every input and the process of thinking itself brings about changes in our brains. In the 1990s, researchers in England did brain scans on 16 London taxi cab drivers and also on a control group. And they found that the hippocampus, the part of our brain which is related to spatial orientation, was greatly enlarged in the taxi drivers as compared to the control group. Moreover, the drivers who had been on the job longer had even larger hippocampuses. The chemically triggered synapses that link our neurons program us, in effect, to want to keep exercising the circuits that are formed. This is how the brain fine-tunes its operations, and repeated activities are carried out more quickly, efficiently, and accurately. And of significance is that unused circuits are basically pruned away. And you can see a graph here that the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex form proteins at a much higher rate than even muscle tissue, which is mostly protein. It was Dr. Eric Kandel in his book, In Search of Memory, describes how he discovered that information gets transferred from working memory to long-term memory by the synthesis of proteins, special proteins. It takes about an hour for that to happen. And if working memory is constantly being flooded with new, unrelated bits of data, the transfer of facts from the long-term memory is basically impeded. And it's these proteins that create long-term memory. And they have the ability to induce the neurons to produce more copies of themselves on and on into the future. And that is how long-term memory is preserved. The brain basically practices survival of the busiest, the skills and habits that are repeated, reinforced, and fine-tuned. The circuits that are not used often basically begin to wither. We lose their function. And these include the circuits that create the proteins for long-term memory. The less we use them as time goes by, the less ability we have to transfer data to our long-term memory. And the more we immerse ourselves in digital technology that exists today, we're losing that ability to enrich the long-term memory. History has shown that we do not go back to older technologies. As you can see, all those things are pretty obsolete. The old technologies wither, just as the neuronal circuits in our brain that are not used. The inevitable forward evolution of technology will continue, and so will its effect on us. The more we're distracted, the less we get to use our long-term memory. And as mentioned in the video, long-term memory is almost limitless as far as we know. Basically, input goes through the short-term memory or working memory. And once it's in long-term memory, it's like a filing cabinet. And sometimes it takes time to retrieve those memories. Sometimes we've all had the experience of wanting to recall a situation or a fact, and it just doesn't come to the tip of our tongue. A few minutes later, there it is. It just takes time to go through the file cabinet to find the file that we had put in there in the past. The neuroscientists have come to understand that long-term memory, as mentioned in the video, is the seat of our understanding. It stores not just facts, but it has the ability to mesh together all possibly even separate facts. It organizes these bits of information into patterns of knowledge, which gives the depth to our thinking. Our intellectual ability is derived from this ability, and even facts and ideas acquired over long periods can be stitched together. This is what gives us experience and allows us to perform better in the future on even unrelated tasks. Most of us grew up pre-internet, and we know what it is to do concentrated reading and deep thinking. But what about kids growing up with the internet? The internet is programming generations of kids to be dependent. Kids these days do not typically read left to right or top to bottom. They skim. There's nothing inherently wrong with skimming. We do it all the time. When we read the newspaper, we skim, but if we find something of interest, we can concentrate on it, give it our full attention and absorb it. About 2 years ago, I went in for a routine physical, and my doctor, who was a man in about his 50s, for some reason decided to tell me this little story that took place in his office a few weeks prior. He had a third-year medical student from Albany Medical College shadowing him. And they had a patient who came in with a significant problem. They did a thorough examination of the patient. They reviewed his history. They reviewed his blood work. The doctor took the student out into the hall and asked him, "What do you think is the diagnosis?" The student whipped out his phone and said, "Okay, Google." The doctor said, "What are you doing?" The kid said, "I'm going to get you the answer." The doctor tried to explain that you're supposed to know this stuff. You're not supposed to depend on anything else but your brain for the answers. And it's just a sign of what's happening to us. And as mentioned in the video, hyperlinks distract us. Studies have shown that the mere presence of them is distracting on a document, even when we don't click on them. Another study had two groups read a document, one with hyperlinks that they did not click on and one without hyperlinks. And then they were tested, and the group without hyperlinks performed better. Because even if you don't click on them, your brain has to decide click or don't click. It unconsciously, your brain is distracted, whether you realize it or not. Another study had two groups read the same document. And then one group took a walk in a quiet park. The other group took a walk through a busy downtown area. Afterwards, they were tested, and the group who walked through the quiet park performed much better on recalling the content. The conclusion was that the group walking through the park had time for their working memory to transfer the data, the information from the document to the long-term memory, whereas the group walking through the busy downtown area was distracted and didn't have that same ability. Basically, distraction is the enemy of long-term memory, and the internet companies basically want to distract us. For example, as mentioned in the video, Google earns money two ways that we know of. One is merchants pay Google in a bidding process. The more they pay, the higher their ad is placed when you search. The second way is that Google gets paid each time you click on an ad. So their artificial intelligence programs and their algorithms basically mines your data and figures out what interests you the most. And those ads end up be playing higher in your search. The less clicked on ads disappear. So Google is mining your data to spoon feed you what it believes you want to see, so you click more on the ads and they make more money. It's a vicious loop. The more you search, the more you click, the more they control you, the more they have control over what you see. Additionally, Google's goal is to digitize all of the world's information and dispense it in small snippets with ads in tow. The process of digitizing everything has side effects. To make a book discoverable on the internet means to dismember it. You can just read selected pages, read selected sections, or read summaries of the book. I did a Google search for The Sun Also Rises, and I got links for what is it about, what is the message, what is the climax, what is Jake's injury, what's the significance of the title, what is the significance of the bull, and many more. You can basically avoid reading the book and probably pass a test in English literature. The problem is you'll miss being stimulated. You'll miss out on the cohesion of its text, and the linearity of its argument will be sacrificed. You won't be stimulated, your long-term memory won't get what you really need. And of course, if you click on any of these links, every page is going to be filled with links, tools, tabs, and ads, each vying for your attention. So you won't be able to absorb even these snippets as well. So it appears the trend is toward fragmentation of knowledge, not only in our brains, but in the resources available as well. We've all heard the saying, nature follows the path of least resistance. And this applies to human behavior as well. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman describes two systems in our brains. System one is fast, instinctive, and emotional. System two is slower, more deliberative, and it's more logical, sometimes referred to as our executive function. However, we most often default to system one. It takes work and conscious effort to engage system two, and we don't normally like to do it unless we have to. The internet, unfortunately, just makes it way too easy to let ourselves slide down that slippery slope of bits of data. Why should we ponder and analyze? The net just gives us quick, easy answers. So it seems the information age has changed our view of memory itself. Wired magazine, monthly American magazine published and printed online that focuses on how emerging technologies affect culture and the economy and politics, has a writer, Clive Thompson, who refers to the internet as his outboard brain. that is taking over the role of his previously used inboard brain. He claims to have almost given up trying to remember anything because he can instantly retrieve it online. And David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, makes a similar point. He states that he thought the magic of the information age was that it will allow us to know more, but now he states that it actually allows us to know less, since we have external cognitive silicone servants. But the fallacy in their thinking is that biological memory is very different from computer memory. Computer truly absorbs information and saves it as is, whereas our brains continue to process the information long after it's received and correlate it with previously stored information, just hence enhancing any given bit that we've absorbed. It ties it together into more comprehensive bundles. Biological memory is alive, and as we know, computer memory is not. And evidence also shows that as we build up our personal store of memories, our minds become sharper. Very active remembering appears to modify the brain in a way that makes it easier to learn ideas and skills in the future. Every tool opens possibilities, and at the same time, it imposes limitations. The more we use it, the more we mold ourselves to its form and function. When the social media draws us in, it's easy to lose the distinction between humans and machines. The proliferation of bots only makes this worse. I know two people who play Scrabble online. It allows them to play with real people that they know or don't know, and to play with bots and to chat. And sometimes they can't tell the difference. And sometimes I don't think they care about the difference. In the 1960s, an MIT computer scientist, Joseph Weizenbaum, wrote a program that was able to dissect written language, to take apart the sentences, and then reply in the form of a question. He called the program Eliza, after Eliza Doolittle from My Fair Lady. Basically, if you sat at a terminal and typed in, "I feel sad today," the computer would respond, "Why do you feel sad today?" And you might type in, "I felt sad for 3 weeks," and it would respond, "Why do you feel sad for 3 weeks?" And you might respond, "Because I was fired from my job." And the computer would ask, "Why were you fired from your job?" You could say, "My boss was mean and hated me." And it would say, why is your boss mean? Why did he hate you? And on and on. This basically, to the people at MIT at the time who had access to computers, were basically taken by it. And one day, Mr. Weizenbaum walked into his office and found his secretary, who knew full well it was just a program with basic instructions, talking to the program. The crazy thing is, she kindly asked him to leave the room as her conversation was becoming intimate, knowing it was a machine. She was having an intimate conversation with a machine. Notable psychiatrists at the time thought the program would be useful in psychiatric hospitals that were short-staffed therapists. And Carl Sagan even proposed having banks of computers available to the public, much as payphones were then, but people for a few dollars could log on and have a non-directed therapy session with a machine. It just boggles my mind, but that is reality that occurs sometimes. We become dependent on ways that I couldn't imagine. A Dutch psychologist conducted an experiment in which he had two groups of people solve puzzles online. One group had very helpful user-friendly software that gave them hints and directions and guided them through solving the puzzles. The other group had bare-bones software with no online help. Initially, the group with the help performed better, but in a short time, the group without help outperformed the first group dramatically because they learned to understand the program. They learned to think and plan ahead and strategize their moves. A few months later, he had these two groups return and each solve a new set of puzzles. This time, they both used the same basic, non-helpful software. And the group that had used the non-helpful software the first time outperformed the group that had help the first time because their brains had improved their problem-solving capacity. So this is something that stayed with them over time. And his conclusion was that the brighter the software, the dimmer the user. This reminds me of the use, well, what we had to do in the past in taking a trip is to read a map. Studies have shown that you form neuronal circuits. When you read a map, you analyze the data and the spatial relations on it. This is as opposed to using a GPS where you just blindly follow instructions. You lose that benefit of thinking and improving your mind. In 2007, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone. At the end of his presentation, he showed a slide with an image of the phone, and he said, "This changes everything." Wrapped around the image of the phone was the text, "Your life in your pocket." And now we need to be concerned about the pickpockets. Facebook's first president, Sean Parker, admits that from the start, social networks were designed to exploit our vulnerabilities in human psychology. The goal of their programming was to maximize, quote unquote, time on device. This is a term common in Las Vegas and Silicon Valley. The internet industry may have begun in idealism, but now it's powered by manipulative and very lucrative feedback loops. The more we use them, the more data they gather on us, and the more seductive the apps become, and their money rolls in. Our vulnerabilities are being exploited, and we are hooked. No question about it. As you can see, she's having a lot of anxiety about her phone broken. And if she has to stand in line, what is she going to do? Well, she waits. She needs an invisible friend, but her friend is on the phone. The invisible imaginary friend is on the phone. So what can you do? And now I'm going to take a little license to depart from the shallows and to expand on the concepts in the book about what is happening to us and extrapolate that into a slightly bigger picture. Among the many benefits of technologies, and there are many, I admit, are neural interfaces. They can allow a paralyzed person, as you see there's a device on her head reading her brain waves, allows her to control a prosthetic arm, to give her a drink. Here's an example of a man with a prosthetic limb and a neural interface that's allowing him to control a purely prosthetic limb. And these are advances that definitely help us. And the continual miniaturization of technology will bring us new devices and also new ways of being connected. This is a picture of Google Glass, came out several years ago. It's no longer available to the public, but it's available to many companies. Google Glass is packed with Bluetooth, with Wi-Fi, with GPS, with speakers, a camera, a microphone, a touchpad, and possibly a gyroscope to detect head tilts. But the main attraction is the tiny screen about the size of your finger that shows you all the information just as a computer screen would. Looking at trends in a bigger picture, I can foresee having brainwave sensors sitting on the frames of the Google Glass devices. So you won't need the microphone. You may just think, log me onto Facebook or Amazon, I want to go shopping. You can just think these things and they'll appear on your screen. And the input, instead of being by a speaker, might possibly be via electromagnetic waves directly into your brain. And the next step might be to make things small enough so you can have a chip implanted somewhere in your head. I know it seems like science fiction, but so is Jules Verne's books, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, From Earth to the Moon. What about the original Star Trek with their communicators? That was pure fiction at the time. And in 2001, A Space Odyssey, we saw talking computers and a space station, which we could only dream of at the time. Basically, we're on the cusp of an evolutionary change in culture, communication, and our brains. We've evolved to create computers in the net, and thus we are inducing an evolutionary process in our brains. We can't go back. The evolution is inevitable. Resistance is futile. We will be assimilated, given enough time. I think we already partly are. Noted historian Yuval Noah Harari, in his book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, points out that the trend is toward fewer and fewer people becoming more and more powerful and able to control more and more of us. The new digital technology only makes it much easier for them to do it. Our perception of reality will depend on what the purveyors of artificial intelligence and Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., decide that we should be seeing, buying, thinking, and believing. In case anyone hasn't seen the movies The Matrix or The Truman Show, they basically involve people living in a simulated reality, which is controlled by machines or other people. Given all the proceeding and tying this all together, looking at trends, we could easily be evolving into such a future. So the topic began with what the internet is doing to our brains. But I think if we look at the bigger picture, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Thank you. Any questions?